Welcome to From What If to What Next, the podcast where we demand the impossible and hopefully help you to realize that maybe it's not quite as impossible after all. If this is your first time here, you've got a lot of catching up to do, and I hope this episode might inspire you to immerse yourself in our archive of conversations, our incredibly rich collection of delicious explorations of the what-if questions that matter. Today's podcast is also being recorded visually in order to be shown as part of the Creative Bureaucracy Festival, so we're honoured to be able to contribute to that too. And while we're on the subject of contributing, this is my opportunity to tell you that From What If to What Next is only made possible by the remarkable folks who contribute to support us at patreon.com/From What If to What Next, and who, for the price of a cup of coffee a month, enable us to do this. In return, they get episodes the moment they're released, plus our much loved bonus Ministry of Imagination episodes, plus other occasional goodies too, such as our recent chat with Max Haven. And if you enjoy today's conversation, do consider subscribing. It really helps. Thanks. Today, we're bringing together two amazing activists and thinkers. We're recording this episode a couple of weeks after Extinction Rebellion's 2-week Impossible Rebellion, an incredible fortnight of very visible activism in London. And I've noticed over these many months of COVID in online talks and workshops that I've given or attended that everyone is trying to figure out as the forces driving the world towards extinction becoming increasingly brazen, shameless, unaccountable, ruthless, and corrupt, how best to respond. I meet with XR groups wondering if they should be more like transition groups wondering if they should be more like XR groups, and so on and so on. And yet rarely do we stop and reflect on the extent to which, as activists, we are entangled in the very structures and systems we're trying to change, how we do things might be impacting what we do or try to do. Activism is a world which often, in spite of working to change the world, ends up recreating it. Its patterns of dysfunction, rates of burnout, unhealthy working practices, power over relationships. Might it be that we get stuck in patterns where we react against perceived injustice, but never really recognize how we embody those same injustices, indeed how we also manifest them unconsciously in how we move through the world? Can we, as activists, find the tools to, as one of our guests today puts it, to understand that transforming ourselves is inherently part of transforming the world? Our question, therefore, for today's conversation is, what if activists paid attention to their own development as well as the problems of the world? I couldn't be more pleased with the two phenomenal guests that we have here today. Anthea Lawson is a campaigner and author who's worked on campaigns to shut down tax havens, prevent banks from facilitating corruption and environmental devastation, and control the arms trade. At Global Witness, she launched a prize-winning campaign that changed the rules on secret company ownership and resulted in new laws in dozens of countries. She began her working life as a reporter at the Times newspaper. Her recent book, The Entangled Activist, is about why activists so often end up recreating the problems they are trying to fix, and how we might begin to look at the task of changing the world differently. And Alistair McIntosh has been described by the BBC as one of the world's leading environmental campaigners, a pioneer of modern land reform in Scotland. He helped to bring the Isle of Egg into community ownership. On the Isle of Harris, he negotiated the withdrawal of the world's biggest cement company, Lafarge, from a devastating super quarry plan. He then served, unpaid to avoid conflicts of interest, on the company's sustainability stakeholder panel for 10 years to help further corporate social and environmental responsibility. He guest lectures on non-violence at the military staff colleges, including for over 2 decades on some of the UK Defence Academy's most senior courses. His books include Soul and Soil, People versus Corporate Power, and most recently, The Brilliant Riders on the Storm. He's a Quaker with an interfaith outlook, focusing much of his work around spirituality. He's a founding trustee of the Galgale Trust, which works with poverty, community, and human potential, and honorary professor in the College of Social Sciences at Glasgow University. Welcome, both of you, to From What If to What Next. It's such a delight to have you both here.
Thank you. Absolute honour and a real pleasure.
So I'm going to start by asking a really big question, which is, if putting facts in front of people isn't enough to unlock the uprising, the massive shift that we need, as you both recognize in your books, and if we urgently need that kind of mass mobilization across society, what might work? Like everybody feels like they're sort of fumbling around for, I was on the streets with Extinction Rebellion there last weekend, and everybody's like, what does it take? What do we need to do? And I wonder through both of your work, what your sense is of, what do we need to do right now? What's the most skillful way forward from here? Anthea?
I think what I'm about to say comes from the perspective of having spent a long time trying to put facts in front of people and expect them to do things in response. Sometimes policymakers, sometimes the public, more often policymakers in the work I was doing to get new laws. I've come to the conclusion, and I've heard similar things from a lot of the campaigners I've interviewed, is we have to start speaking our truth from our hearts, and being really honest about our own feelings, because ultimately genuine communication from the heart, rather than just sort of firing off facts at people and hoping that they'll do things, are the way that we're going to reach people. And there, Extinction Rebellion is a movement that is trying to do that in some aspects of what it's doing. There are other aspects of what it's doing that's still saying, here are some facts and here are the really, really, really scary ones. There's lots of interesting climate psychology that's suggesting that once you put people into a kind of triggered fear state, they're not going to be able to hear it anyway. So somehow we need to be in the state where we can have the conversations, and people are in a state where they can hear what we're saying, and connection is going to be the way to do that, I think.
Thank you. Alistair?
I think the only thing that can work is an activation of love, an opening of consciousness. Yes, technologies are hugely important. I'm a great fan of green technologies. We've got solar panels on our roof. They feed into an air-to-air source heat pump. We've got insulation on both our outside and inside walls of a Victorian terrace house. But even that has only reduced our domestic carbon footprint from 5.3 tons to just under 2 tons, which is great, but we're still churning out 2 tons a year just from our domestic use. So technology is important, but basically it's got to be in our consciousness. What shifts that? You don't get this kind of an awareness where there is high affluence, where there is no suffering. I'm in France just now. You go into every small village, there's a war memorial. Was talking to my father-in-law last night. The bottle of wine had a brand name, 1938. He said that was when I was born. I don't mean the wine was 1938, it was just the brand. And I said to him, so do you remember the Second World War? And he opened up about the bombs falling and going down into the shelters, that kind of stuff. And a consequence of that suffering was that you had all these international agencies, you had all the lines of hope for the world, United Nations agencies in particular, set out, which are now being degraded because there's not the political will to support that kind of one world internationalism. And here's where I think we really do have to learn from COVID. We really do have to take on board the suffering that maybe not those of us who have been fortunate are experiencing, but I'm sure most of us have lost friends through COVID or known friends who have really suffered. And we have to use this as our wake-up call. We have to look at what is happening to the earth. We have to look at the loss of green spaces, the loss of species, the desecration of our rivers, you name it. And treat that as our wake-up call. Don't waste it. Never let a crisis go to waste. Treat that as a wake-up call to open up the channels of understanding and of love.
Thank you. And Alistair, you write very powerfully in Riders on the Storm about trauma. You talk about how it can hollow us out and lead to overconsumption in terms of in search of meaning. And you also write very movingly, I thought, about Donald Trump's mother and the island that she came from and the traumas that shaped it. which I really recommend to people. As activists, how can our own trauma play out consciously or unconsciously? How does it shape the activists we become? And what might activism that really understood and integrated trauma look like? Alistair.
Mm-hmm. Well, I grew up on the Isle of Lewis. My father was a GP, a doctor there. And we grew up amongst Donald Trump's relatives. His mother emigrated from the Isle of Lewis in the 1930s, and talking about her in the village, we've counted at least 7 layers of trauma that woman experienced that led so many to leave the islands in the 1930s. The first layer was in the 1820s, when on 2 sides of Donald Trump's maternal line, the people were evicted from their land, the so-called Highland clearances, were kicked out of their land. They were given hardly no notice. They had to sail to the end of my village, an area called Crosspost. Some of them lived in upturned boats, and there was a terrible toll of disease and suffering. And then they were moved to an area of the island where the sea was very exposed, where they lost a lot of men fishing. And then you had the First World War, which killed 1 in 5 young men on the island. And then at the end of the First World War, another 200 were drowned when a ship bringing them home hit rocks just 5 miles away from where Mary Ann MacLeod, Mrs. Trump, grew up. Then you had the Spanish flu and the tuberculosis, both of which had probably come in with returning soldiers. And then you had, out of an island of 30,000, mass immigration in the 1920s. 1923 alone, 1,000, mainly young men, left for America. So who was she going to marry? So she took a chance. She went to America. She met Frederick Christ Trump. And the Donald was raised in a big house with servants, with parents who were too busy to have time for him. He was, I think you could say, given no boundaries, no context of learning empathy. The way that I look on it, Rob, is that people like me, we were held in the basket of the community. A basket is semi-permeable. It's not a trap. It's semi-permeable. It supports you. We were held in that basket. We were, our headstrong tendencies were moderated by the community around us. Fishing, working the land, hunting, singing, all of the things you do, to going to church and so on. It was a very religious community. But Donald Trump, he would have had none of that. He wasn't held, he was an islander out of the island. He wasn't held in that context. And something triggered off in him that went the way it did. Now, the way I see it, and the way I put it in Riders of the Storm, is I talk about the 4 Cs. That irrespective of where we come from, most of us are descended from people who would have been cleared off the land. You had the Highland clearances in Scotland. You also had the lowland clearances. In England, it was called the enclosures, and they were pretty wholesale, as you know, the stripping away of the common land from the common people. Same across other parts of Europe. Most of us have experienced that clearance, which is very significant because it is an uprooting from both place and community with one another. A consequence of that clearance is the second C, collapse, an inward psychological collapse, where we no longer get our fulfillment from being communities of place. And instead, we have to buy it. We have to work for it. We have to conquer to get it. The Highlanders and Islanders who went to America, what did they do? They had to join the military, or they ran the slave plantations. And then when you do that kind of thing, of course, you've got to be a racist. Otherwise, you can't live with yourself. And so that gets ingrained into your culture. So clearance, collapse, consumption. How do you fill that psychological, spiritual emptiness? You try to fill it with more and more stuff. It's an addiction. It's like a drug addiction. What is the antidote to clearance, collapse, consumption? I believe it's community. Remaking community, both urban and rural, with land reform in the kind of ways that I've described. And that way, That way you start to recognize and to heal the trauma. In Scotland, the big movement was the Scottish government and with civic organizations to become an ACE-aware, ACE, Adverse Childhood Experience Aware nation. So that we don't say to people, I live in Govan, a hard-pressed area, where some people have done terrible things to each other. You no longer say, what did you do? Rather, you say, what happened to you?
Anthea, your thoughts down on trauma.
I noticed that when I started thinking about trauma and activism, so I was asking a question when I was writing The Entangled Activist. I had a couple of questions. One of them was this question which had occurred to me over 20 years of different types of campaigning and activism, which was, why is it that we are so often doing precisely the things that we're asking other people not to do, treating other people badly when we're fighting for human rights and so on. And my other question was about what felt missing. It felt like some kind of attention to our inner life, whether we couch that in spiritual terms, which not everybody's comfortable to do, or psychological terms, or just using that term sort of inner world. Most people are comfortable with that in some sense. Something felt missing in all of our busyness. So I was talking to lots of campaigners about this, and the question of trauma was coming up. And at first I didn't see it. And some of the people I was talking to didn't see it either. They couldn't see the link. And it took me a few conversations and some reading and some thinking to start realizing why that was, which is that I had been approaching my campaigning from a perspective of privilege. I'm come from a middle-class family in the southeast of England, and I turned to activism, so I thought, to help others. That's what I thought I was doing, and a lot of the people I'd worked with in those organisations thought they were doing that. And the people who were saying, what's trauma got to do with it, were the ones who had come from that perspective. And it took talking with people who had been doing activism, fighting for their own lives in whatever way, and talking to psychologists who'd worked kind of across activist movements, including Sophie Banks, who'd helped set up Transition and was working on the inner transition aspect, for me to start to see it. Of course, the people who have been most impacted by the actions and the workings and the machinations of the dominant culture, of course they're going to know about trauma and what it does to us. And the people who have in some ways benefited from that and think that they're turning to their activism to help are less likely to have thought about it. So that was the first part of it. And I had to sort of, get a sort of grip of myself and think about what it was I was really doing in this. And this is where I started acknowledging my own entanglement in the very questions I was asking. But actually, this is why I really love the way you've written that chapter in Riders on the Storm, Alistair, because what we're talking about here is that trauma has passed down the generations in different ways everywhere. Because of the culture that we're in. It's happened in these islands. There has been colonisation within these islands. People have lost their land. And all of this has happened. And to say that is not to draw any equivalence with the suffering that people from these islands have inflicted elsewhere through colonisation and enslavement. There's no equivalence. And it's definitely and we need to look at what has travelled down the line here, because what I find very compelling is what a number of sort of somatic and trauma therapists are talking about, is the way that the patterns of trauma have become normalised in our society. And so even people who don't feel like they've had any particularly adverse experiences themselves, we are still behaving in ways, and this is really visible it's visible in lots of ways in the culture, but it's visible in specific ways in how activism takes place, I think, that we're enacting some of these patterns without realising it. So when our nervous systems are up, to use completely unscientific lingo, just to keep it simple for a moment, I know it doesn't work like this, it's more complex, but we're talking about fight and flight. We are more likely to see things in terms of power games and dominance. We're more likely to be constantly on the run, manifesting in this sort of constant activity. Another aspect of trauma patterning in the culture is numbness. It's a shutting down, and it's that shutting down that we're doing when we turn away from something and don't want to look at its impact, when we're feeling kind of paralyzed and can't act, or when we, even as activists trying to do our best, don't really want to look at the impact of what we're doing, and whether what we're doing is the right thing. So I'm really curious, and now that I've started noticing, I feel I can see it, and I'm really drawn to descriptions of people who are sort of expert in this, because you start to see it everywhere in how we run our campaigning, and there are lots of questions about whether going at it, even though the problem is so unbelievably urgent. There's a paradox here. The problem is incredibly urgent and we do need to act, and yet acting from that place of activated urgency in ourselves is not going to be the best way of doing it, because we'll get too kind of sort of stuck ourselves in that panic mode. We won't be heard clearly, and we will be activating it in other people, which isn't good for them and isn't good for our sort of chances of communicating and being able to be in connection about what matters. Thank you.
Alistair.
Rob, could I just come in on that? I mean, can I first of all make an observation, which is how, when you consider Anthea's previous work with things like tax issues and so on, she's really built up a strong credibility base to be doing this from. So it's hard to knock somebody like Anthea down when you look at that track history and say, oh, you're just talking woo-woo stuff, which of course is one of the things I'll throw at you. And I think that's an important thing, because when young activists say to me, how can we become activists and do the kind of thing you're doing? One of the things I say is learn how to be useful. Learn how you cut your teeth doing things that are recognized as being useful, and then you will strengthen your own voice. And the second observation, in terms of the trauma we carry without realizing it, I think it's always helpful when we can see things happening in the culture that we can use to make that explicit, to unmask the powers that be, so to speak. And my good friend Nick Duffel, who wrote a pioneering book called The Making of Them, the making of the men, as it was, who ran the British Empire through the public school, the private school system, and has followed it up with another book. Well, he's got several now, but the other book is called Wounded Leaders, where he's looking at people like Tony Blair and George Bush. He's bringing out the kind of thing that is now coming up almost weekly in the press about Boris Johnson and his set, and the way in which they are part of a culture where brutalization and trauma has been built in from an early age. And that's hugely important to understand, because in the icons, look at the wall behind me, in the icons that these people offer, we see into deeper and sometimes closer to home realities for the rest of us, and can start openly asking questions about what might we be carrying without realizing it, that affects our disposition towards life and leads us on these paths of violence and environmental destruction.
Thank you. One of the things I've noticed and experienced in the transition movement over the past decade or so has been how questions around inner and outer transition, inner and outer activism can polarize, can become gendered, can fracture into kind of distinct positions. Yet the ideal here is that as activists, we can embody both, that our movements are sufficiently comfortable with polarity rather than the need to find the position and the answer. And Anthea, in your book, you write about a conversation with Andrew Sims, where he talks about how the left are terrible at that and the right are really great at just glossing over the things they disagree with. What's your sense of how we should balance inner and outer in our movements, and how we can create a culture where we're okay with polarity? Anthea.
Well, there's lots of things to say to this question, because I think one of the dynamics that's going on here is that the polarity that emerges in, for example, our campaigning movements and, the inner and outer of transition is a very interesting example, because, hey, at least transition is having a go at doing inner. There's plenty of organisations that aren't looking at it at all. It polarizes, I think, in our campaigning scenarios, precisely because as campaigners, we're entangled in the wider set of problems. It's polarized in the culture because we have been told for a long time that, so it's, you can take this back to different levels, but let's just take sort of Enlightenment thinking, which basically tells us that our rational capacity, our thinking, cogitating capacity, and our sort of using that to go and actively do stuff in the world has primacy. And that has primacy over, I mean, you use the word woo-woo, Alistair, but that's perfect because that's exactly what happens. Even if we're not explicitly doing that, I think a lot of us have got that implicit assumption in ourselves because we've just sort of absorbed it from the culture. It manifests in so many ways. So we're reflecting what's going on. So I wonder whether the question is not so much kind of, can we accept that it's polarized, but can we learn to move more easily? I think you've talked about this as well, Alistair. Learn to move more easily between the two so that we don't end up pushing ourselves into these things. And this question also of understanding and being more comfortable contemplating the existence of our own shadow, the shadow being, the part of ourselves that we want to push away out of conscious awareness. It might be things that the culture or our families have told us that are not okay, earlier on in life. We don't want to know that bit of ourselves, and so we react to it in other people. And so sometimes when we're having these reactions against what somebody else is expressing, we're reacting to something in ourselves that we've pushed out of the way or to experiences we've had in the past. And so this is yet another example where becoming more comfortable with the darkness in ourselves, with the completeness of ourselves, makes us more comfortable with what other people are doing, and we can be more comfortable with the glorious kind of messy complexity of life rather than having to even see it as a polarity.
Thank you. Alistair?
Well, I'm just thinking, it's interesting, Anthea, the books about the psychology of activism that are out there, they don't sell particularly well. And so they go out of print. It's just the way it is. I mean, but I've got coming to my mind as you're speaking, Anthea, a wonderful one that you can still pick up secondhand on the internet by an Australian activist called Katrina Shields. She was a health service professional, and her book is called In the Tiger's Mouth. And I think it's subtitled something like An Activist Guide to Empowerment or something like that. It's from the 1980s, where a lot of really good activism was happening in Australia, especially around the nuclear-free Pacific and the whole rainforest issue, things like John Seed's Rainforest Action Group and so on. And she's got a cartoon in that book that speaks exactly to what you were just saying, Anthea. And the cartoon is, you've got all the activists walking around a square in a circle, and they're all carrying their placards. And it's kind of, save the whales, screw the corporation, down with the government, etc. And the very last person is carrying one that says, I hate my dad.
Yeah, it's really powerful, that, isn't it?
You see, it's kind of like the buck maybe stops with the government, but in a democracy, the buck starts here. And so we can't separate these two things. We can't just go pointing the finger at the corporations and the government and even the media without also saying, if I read something like the Daily Mail or, a climate denying newspaper like the Daily Telegraph or something like that, that's because it's latching into something that is in me. And if I start to resolve that in myself, I won't want to read that kind of stuff anymore. So we can't just blame the forces that exploit, if you like, the Microsoft security vulnerabilities in our own psyches. We've got to do the work of figuring out what's going on in our own systems. And then as we become less vulnerable to these things, so we'll be able to progressively start to shape a different democracy. And it's all very well to say, well, that's all going to take too long, because people, I mean, I don't know about you, Anthea, but all the time, when I talk like I talk, I'll get people saying, we haven't got time to go down that path. We've got to act now. We've got to fix it now, 2025 or whatever. But I end up saying to them, well, are you going to do that in a democracy? I mean, here I am in the south of France. Verena and I were confused today because the Google was saying the speed limit was still 80 kilometers an hour, and the signs were saying 90 kilometers. We were thinking, what's going on? Because in 2018, France brought down the speed limit on country roads from 90 to 80. That's 50 miles an hour. And how come the signs are now saying 90? So when I got back, I Googled it. And because of the action of the gilets jaunes, the yellow vests, with something like 80% of French speed cameras being vandalized, the government backtracked, and the government has left it up to different departments. So some departments are still at 80, others, like where we were today, at 90, and others haven't decided. But what that is highlighting is that it's all very well to take a sensible measure like what the French government did in 2018. But unless you take the people with you, it's not going to stick. And you can only take the people with you if you do the work that drives their deepest motivations, which is where the questions you are raising about trauma, Anthea, are so crucial. I mean, trauma, let us remember, what is trauma? It is a Greek word that means injury. Trauma is injury. So surgical trauma is the shock the body goes into after the injury of surgery. Psychological trauma is the shock our psyches, our souls, our deep mentalities go into when we've been hit by the violence of the world.
That's right. And I think one of the things it changes is our perception. And so
yes.
that sort of trauma perception, I think, can help and that sounds like a positive word, but its effect is to flatten things. Its effect is to polarize, because it puts you in a situation where you're more afraid, and so you're more, in a sort of, let's think about this on an evolutionary basis, you are going to need to make quick fire determinations about what's enemy and what's friend. And that's the polarizing mentality. And so what's very interesting about these questions about urgency is I can find myself talking about these topics, and people are thinking that they're convinced that what they're hearing is me saying, oh, well, we can't do the activism. You have to go and attend to yourselves. And so here's yet another polarity, not just between the inner and the outer, but you can't do them at the same time. Yeah. Like, actually, you can do them at the same time. Practice is a really good way of practicing different ways of being. You can't just sort of make a determination in your head. No change takes root in us unless we go and have a go at doing it differently. And activism is a great place to have a go at trying it, whilst we're continuing to do these very urgent things that need to happen.
And I mean, I think one of the good things was, I mean, as you know, I'm quite critical of some aspects of exile, but I think one of the very good things is that it has actually been open to the space. It's been open to the spiritual in a way that previous movements and more mainstream movements have often been uncomfortable with. So it's opened up the space. And once you say it's about perception, Anthea, once you start seeing, then that can start to influence your being, and that can start to influence your doing. So you're on a trajectory, you're on a roll then.
Yes, and that sort of trajectory, I think, sort of confounds our sort of simplistic cause and effect, pull this lever, stick facts in front of somebody and they'll do this kind of idea of campaigning. I think one of the problems is that because of the way that campaigning has been professionalized over the last 2 decades, when you're, and that's great because lots of work gets done and people can be paid to do the work. That's obviously good. But the flip side of that is you have to say to your funders, this is what we're going to do. These will be the measurements by which we will show we will have done it. And it gets you thinking that things happen in that I'm going to press that button and that guy over there is going to change that law. And that makes it harder for us to take on this idea that just by being differently, something different might arise in the field around us, and that then ripples outwards.
So if you're both arguing that activism can be a springboard or a path into the sort of deep and timeless questions about what it means to be human, just as spiritual teachers might suggest as well. What would you say strike you as the best examples you've seen of this in practice? What stand out to you as the movements or the campaigns or the activism that is as close to sort of doing it in the way that you feel we should be? Alistair?
Well, for me, it would be the Black Civil Rights Movement in America, which is also so powerful in terms of non-violence. And the way in which some of the leaders of that movement are currently concerned that the spirituality that underwrote the original thing is being forgotten about. And that in a secular, in a materialistic world, you get people trying to do Black civil rights, but devoid of that foundation in liberation theology, in theology that liberates the human spirit, devoid of that foundation. To me, that is hugely important. Of course, a lot of that was bouncing off Mahatma Gandhi and what he did in India. So to me, these are the great things. And then there are many other examples since then of how nonviolent activism has brought about political change. But the interesting thing is that unless the deeper psychological, psychospiritual structures, the deeper layers in a population are addressed, simply having a revolution won't stick. You can have your revolution, but as Anthea has been pointing out, if the old structures and the old issues are unresolved, the revolutionaries will just go the same way. And that is why it's so important that we work not in the short wave, but on the long wave with this. So that would be my answer. The Black Civil Rights Movement, I think, is especially inspirational. And I would say, read people like James Cone, read these people and ask what is the relevance of this to climate change activism. It's very deep. And I have to say, Roger Hallam, for example, although I'm very critical of some of Roger's work, he has been opening up those areas and pointing people in that direction, and good on him for doing that.
Thank you. Anthea?
I'm going to fudge that slightly by not choosing a particular movement, but I think I see something when, and people doing this occur all over. I've seen it in lots of different contexts. There's something about a quality of being when people are speaking sort of in the foundation of their, sort of from their own being and from their own rootedness, in where they are and where they're speaking from, that is absolutely palpable. It can be palpable in people's posture. I've seen a photograph in some of the, I forget which year it was from and exactly which city it was. It was from one of the Black Lives Matter protests in the US. And somebody showed me this photo of a woman, just in a sundress and sandals, standing in front of one of these like RoboCop sort of militarized American police. And she's just standing, and it's in her stance. You can see it. This absolutely standing in what needs to be stood for. And that there's a clarity in it, and you can hear it when people speak. Sometimes you can see it in how people communicate, and it's a quality that I'd like us to learn to value and to recognize, because it doesn't always sound the same as the most noisy and the most numbers. It's about a quality of being.
Thank you. We could go on and on and on. It's just so phenomenal, and we do still need to pay a visit to the Ministry of Imagination. So I'm going to ask you my last question, which is that the theme of these podcasts is around imagination and the need to build within our culture what we start to think of as being an imagination infrastructure to create the best conditions for our collective imagination to flourish. I wonder, what are your thoughts on how we might create the best possible conditions for the imagination? By the imagination, I mean the ability to see things as if they could be otherwise within our movements. Anthea, maybe we'll start with you.
Yeah, I love the idea that we can have the imagination to see that we can be differently. We can be different in how we go about our doings. It's funny, we sometimes have these enormously imaginative ideas about what a new economy looks like, or how we're going to solve this problem here and we're going to do that. And the idea itself is beautifully imaginative, and then we go about trying to get it sometimes in some of the old ways, where some of the stuff we've been talking about arises. So for me, it's about the confidence in our imagination to imagine being differently in our process of going about it.
Thank you. Alistair?
I think you've hit on the pivotal issue there, because we're talking about what C.S. Lewis spoke of, if I might paraphrase, as the deep magic of the world set in place when time began. And so there was a shamanic aspect of this. There was a magical aspect of it. When you're asking about movements that influenced us, another one I could have mentioned was coming out of second wave feminism, ecofeminism, and books like, you'll get them still secondhand, Reweaving the World and Healing the Wounds, with these ecological feminist writers doing very deep stuff that takes us into the imaginal realm. How do you get there? I spent yesterday in England with a church group teaching a Quaker method, which I'm going to be teaching with my wife, Veren, from the Glasgow Quaker meeting during COP26 and also online, called Meeting for Clearness, which is when you've got a pressing issue. In this case, it'll be about climate change activism, and you're divided within yourself. How do you enter not just into the imagination, but with clearness? And Meetings for Clearness are a process of sitting in a circle of trust with people who ask you questions that take you into that deep area. And when we were doing it day before yesterday in Great Huxlow in Derbyshire, when we were doing it, some of those clergy, they said in the evening, well, they didn't quite use this language, but they basically said they were still tripping. They were still in that deep imaginal realm that was helping them to see what they were about in their service to the world more clearly. So I think that learning ways, I mean, this is where the arts are so important too. The artists and the musicians, their work is so important, because these are ways of opening the door on the fairy hill, of seeing into that deep magic of the world, seeing clearly what it can mean to be a human being, and teaching one another these approaches that can open these ways of seeing and being and doing.
Here's a question then. So, Anthea, I was reading, in fact, in the bath the other night, the bit in your book about anger in activism, and the question as to whether activists are always really aware as to what it is they're actually really angry about. I was involved in road protests in the early 90s. There were some very angry people there, and I remember thinking, really? Is it just the roads? I think there's a bit more going on here. And how unaddressed anger from other parts of our lives and history can bleed through into our activism. So at a time when anger is on the rise and we're all supposed to be outraged about something, and social media just amplifies our outrage, could you speak a little bit about our relationship to anger? And what does good anger look like, Anthea?
Okay, thanks. So I think one thing we have to say about anger is it's not for anyone to judge somebody else's anger about an issue that they are living, and anger is acknowledged to be an inevitable driver of activism. So what I became very curious about, and this was led including by my own experience, because I used to get really sort of frantic. I mean, people would sort of sometimes ask me, are you all right? Because I'd get so kind of frenetic. Now, I wasn't working on issues that were about the conditions of my own life. I was working on issues that were easy to get angry about, sure. It's very easy to get angry about the arms trade and the way that taxpayers' money gets used to prop up weapons sales to countries where they're used against civilians. And I lived in Sierra Leone soon after the end of the conflict there, and I knew people directly affected. And so that sort of felt like it was giving me a bit more kind of close contacts of justification. You know, I knew people directly affected. But still, I think it's worth kind of complicating that question, because I had seen so many people in the kind of activism I was doing who were really, really, really angry. And I was starting to get a sense that it wasn't all about those things. I think those of us that are kind of a bit primed to get kind of a bit shouty and angry and kind of quick on the mark on this kind of thing, we're drawn towards certain kinds of activism. And so we find ourselves doing it. And what then happens is those kinds of activism repel people who are not comfortable with anger. So it's not helpful kind of for recruitment. I think I like thinking of it like a fire. You know, when you light a fire with some like really fast fuel and it's just going to go whoomph and going to go up, you know, we're all going to get scorched and injured there, and it's not going to be sustainable at all. I think the best we can do with it is work out which bits of it might not be for the issue in question, and which is, you know, it's not something you can just do like that. It's an ongoing process. But B, burn it down a bit. You know, we want some really sort of hot, slow coals here that can keep us going for longer. If it is anger that we're using, you know, I don't think it's realistic to say to people, well, no, you shouldn't be angry and you shouldn't act from anger. I just don't think that's going to happen. But I'd be interested what you think, Alistair.
I'm thinking of one of my mentors, Tom Forsyth, a crofter in the Highlands who started the Isle of Egg Trust, was landform, which I was so involved with. And Tom used to have the expression, speak truth to power in love. And I know the anger you're talking about, which so many activists are motivated by, but I've become increasingly drawn to the Buddhist critique that anger can be quite a deep poison. And so the challenge is, are we speaking what we're speaking in love? And you know, I find that a constant challenge. Often on the Twitter, I'll make a tweet in response to somebody, and then I'll think, sometimes I'll delete it a minute or two afterwards. But, you know, because I look at it and I kind of think, you know, is that spoken in love? And sometimes I will just leave it anyway, kind of fuck it, let it go. and other times I'll quickly undo it. And I think what's going on here, as you've been so brilliantly drawing out tonight, Anthea, is that most of us come into activism at the shallow end of the pool, at the shouty, splashy end of the pool. That's where we begin. That's where we learn to be comfortable in the water. But the waters are the waters of the unconscious, and the unconscious of the collective unconscious of our time. So we don't just stay there, but activism is itself a path, a spiritual path, spiritual activism, as Matt Carmichael, and climate change activist in Leeds, and I have written about it. Activism is a path, and so we start to wade out into the deeper water, and we start to learn to swim, and swim up to the deep end, and we dive. And then this is the really interesting one. And I can't fully unpack what it means, but it just comes up within me with such power. We learn to swim, we learn to dive, and we even learn how to breathe underwater. And I think that breathing underwater is about, you know, I've got all these icons from my mother-in-law's place behind me, but as the psalmist had it, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, yet I shall fear no ill, For thou art with me, the great spirit of life, the Buddha nature, the Tao, the Brahman, the goddess is with me. And thy rod and staff, the symbol of power, the symbol of the path, the staff. And comfort me still, carry me through that path. And so to me, this is about knowing that at a very deep level, you can't kill the spirit, for she is like a mountain, on and on. She is old and strong. There is something in us that can't be killed. There is something in the world that can't be killed. And therefore, you talked earlier about our comportment, our deportment, how we carry ourselves, our bearing, Anthea. You spoke about those things right at the beginning. These start to become so important because we need to understand ourselves, not just in this little narrow moment of time, but in the cosmic wholeness, the eternity that our being comes out of. And I believe that is where the deepest hope for the world comes from, in opening up that kind of consciousness and then working it, weaving that basket into the world, the warp of the world, the long bits of the basket going out at warp speed. And our job as activists in building community, in your transition towns type of stuff, Rob, is weaving in the weft, weaving in the sideways bit. And no matter how small, people will say, oh, you've done such big things of land reform and mountains and so on, but what can I do? And it's, you can be an activist the moment you step out in your street and you give somebody a helping hand or a smile.
I offer a thought on your swimming and breathing underwater. I find that image really powerful. And what was coming to me as you were saying that was, it's a transformation. If we can breathe underwater, we're transforming into something. We're transforming into a creature that can breathe underwater. In the literal terms of your picture there. But so actually, what that is about to me is we are allowing ourselves to be transformed in the process of trying to transform the world. And that's what can feel so scary and challenging. And it doesn't help that we've got an idea that we kind of get to adulthood, learn how to be a grown-up, find a trade or profession, and then off you go and you just slowly mature like a cheese, Like, actually, it is possible to continue to transform ourselves as we go through our lifespan, isn't it? I love that quote from Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler. All that you touch, you change. All that you changes you. I'm
going to sneak one last question in because I'm so curious. So and you both touched on this before, but I was like, oh, I want a little bit more on that. So isn't the fundamental issue here that the spiritual is seen as being about slowing down when the crises that we face all seem to be accelerating and running away from us? So how do we find the point between both of those things, Alistair?
I think it's about being targeted and how we use our lives. The spiritual is about how you live your life, how you use your life, it takes us time. Now, I've lived for 4 years in Papua New Guinea, and in recent years we've been doing some quite deep but sensitive work in the 2 West Papuan provinces of Indonesia. And in one of these communities, there's a woman called Mama Wanma, and she was kind of a traditional spiritual leader. She died a couple of years ago. And we were taken to meet her, a shamanic type of figure. And we were there, and there she was sweeping underneath a tree, which in their tradition, it was a nut that fell off this tree and floated out on the coral reef. And the Blessed Virgin Mary was gathering shellfish because she, of course, is a West Papuan. And the nut inseminated her and so gave birth to the Papuan Christ. So it was an indigenization of the Christian story. So there was Mama Wanma sweeping away slowly with her brush, keeping clean the area underneath the sacred palm tree. And we were there, the group of us with the NGOs and what have you, and the local community leaders, we were all there just lounging around and swimming and sunbathing and waiting for her to come to us. And eventually she wandered over to us. And Mama Wanma looks at us, and I'll never forget her. And she says, "Sit up." Do not be lazy. You have got work to do. Do not waste this life that God has given to you. And it was such a magical coming together. On the one hand, the total laid-backness of spending about 2 hours sweeping under the tree before she came to us. And then coming along with a sit-up. And then, you know, when we thought of it, she had been active the whole time. We were just lounging around. And so I think that what the spiritual does and what seeking clearness does, and I would recommend an American-Canadian book, Insight and Action, which again is out of print, but you'll get it secondhand. Insight and Action, which talks about meetings for clearness, strategic questioning, support groups, etc. What these things do is that they help us to slow down inwardly so that we can see that when we do run, we put our all into running to a destination that is going to be effective. It's like Gandhi said, Rob, when Gandhi was asked, how do you have time to meditate when you've got such a busy life? He said, well, on really busy days, I meditate even longer. I wish I could learn from that because I don't practice that nearly enough, but that's what Gandhi said. And that would be my answer to your question.
Thank you. Anthea?
I think I was going to say something very similar, that the invitation to still ourselves isn't an invitation to stop doing the other stuff that we're doing. It's an invitation to still ourselves in a moment, and we can have lots of those moments. It's an ongoing practice. And in that moment, we make a good decision about what we do next. And acting from that moment of stillness can result in a radically different action to acting from the whizzing around, oh my goodness, this is really busy, I've got to do stuff. I really, that story you just told, Alistair, is fantastic. I think I've got a similar one with a shorter quote from an activist called Jamie Kelsey Fry, who I interviewed for the book. And he said quite simply, what we need is a revolution in our answer to the question, what the fuck are we here for? Like, what, in the moments of stillness, we have a chance of asking that question of ourselves. In the moments of mad dash and urgency, we don't. So to me, that aspect, I mean, there are other aspects of the spiritual, obviously, which is about connection, including with others, as well as the ground of our being. But this aspect of it, the invitation to slow, is an invitation to clarity about what matters.
It's why that wonderful Franciscan Catholic priest, Richard Rohr, R-O-H-R, I think it is, he calls his center the center for action and contemplation. You need both the action and the contemplation to transform the world, starting from here.
Thank you both so much. This has been a brilliant conversation. We should do this every week. This is just brilliant. Thank you both so much for making the time to join us here.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. It's been beautiful. And thank you. Anthea, can you just remind us of the name of your book again?
Yes, it's called The Entangled Activist.
The Entangled Activist, because we're entangled with our outer lives and our inner lives.
Yes, and we're entangled in the problems that we're trying to fix. And we forget that at our peril.
So important.
So my thanks to everyone for listening, to everyone who subscribes and supports this podcast, and to the audio genius that is Ben Adicott, who makes this podcast sound like a party in your ears. We will see you next time. Thank you.